The Lover's Tale. John's childhood ambition was to be a pilot. Let's sit with that a while. A boy grew up, like so many other boys all over the world, watching the skies, imagining himself in the endless blue. What do all these boys dream of? Of watching the world from above, of air starts and power-off glides, of aerial somersaults, of moonlit sorties, of racing through the clouds in 15,000 tons of machinery, of the attractiveness of being a man in uniform. Universal dreams, and not only boys dream them, of course. As universal as love, as family loyalty, as friendship, as kindness, as fear. And like love, loyalty, friendship, kindness, and fear, the dream of being a pilot, however universal in its outlines, must exist and play itself out in very particular circumstances. In John's case, the circumstances start with place, the country of his birth and upbringing, which we'll refer to here as X. And X is where he started the story when we met in London in a room made smaller than it needed to be by the excessive furniture, round tables, too many chairs crammed into it. "I'm from X," he said. "It's a small country. The government is a kind of dictatorship. It used to be a military dictatorship before supposed democracy came back in, but it isn't really a democratic country. The president has been there for a very long time, so things are not as outsiders would see." When he started to speak in his ordered, concise sentences, I knew immediately that he had told his tale before and had learned how to shape it. It came as no surprise near the end of our time together when he said that telling his story was part of his CBT therapy. As a writer, I know the usefulness of stories when confronting our lives. Stories allow us to structure our experiences into beginning, middle, end, and decide which parts to skim over, which to go into in detail. Stories allow us to put forward our own points of view and interpretations. Stories, in short, allow us a measure of control over our memories. In lives such as John's, when control is so often in other people's hands, the value of that must be enormous. It must also be difficult to achieve. As we sat together and his tale unfolded, the ordered retelling began to fracture. Gaps appeared. The story dabbled back on itself. At various points, John cried. I didn't ask him to fill in gaps or expand on details. The reasons should become clear if they aren't already. I'm delaying here. I want us to sit with John, the boy who looked at the sky and dreamed of flying through the constellations. But when we met, John didn't stop on that any longer than it took to say. When I was young, in primary school, my ambition was to become a pilot. So that was my childhood ambition, to be a pilot. But my dad was involved in politics. And so we hurtled into the lover's tale. John's father was not a politician himself, but he financed opposition politicians. This didn't stop John from wanting to join the Air Force, just as it hadn't stopped his stepbrother from joining the army. The route to the skies went through a school that was difficult to get into for anyone who wasn't rich or well-connected. But John scored some of the highest marks in the country's national exams and was admitted. The school was close to the army barracks, which meant John went to live with his stepbrother, the soldier who was stationed there. Soon there was another exam, and John was among those selected at the end of it. Like the others selected with him, he assumed he had scored well. We thought, okay, because we're brilliant, he said. And I briefly glimpsed the confident, bright, would-be pilot. But instead of entering classrooms for the gifted, he and the others were taken to the countryside and made to undergo rituals, such as drinking the blood of dogs. They were cadets now, they were told, and each one of them was assigned to an army officer who had them clean their shoes, their houses, and, in his words, do the dirty things that rich people will not do. They were being taught obedience, and its flip side, fear. At what point, I wonder, did all the brilliant young men who'd been specially selected realize They all belonged to the same tribe, the largest tribe of X, which was not the president's tribe, and from which significant opposition to his rule arose. At what point did they realize they had been selected to spy on and betray their own people? Gradually, we were getting a sense of what was happening, John told me. Gradually, their responsibilities increased from cleaning shoes and accompanying their officer on patrol to befriending people from their own tribe, discovering where their loyalties lay, and reporting them to the authorities if they didn't support the government. Other times, the responsibilities would include planting evidence, a pistol, a gun, in the home of someone they had befriended just before the police arrived with a warrant to search the house. People are picked up and disappeared. They kill them. They do whatever they do to them. I wasn't happy with it. A lot of us weren't happy with it. That wasn't why we were there. By now, John's father was dead, but his brother had taken up his political activities. It wasn't John, but his stepbrother, the soldier, who was ordered to bring that brother in for questioning. The stepbrother told a friend he wasn't prepared to do it. For this act of familial loyalty, he was imprisoned in a room called the punishment room. John, recounting this, gestured around the room we were in, made crowded by a table that could seat at most 8 people around it. If you divide this room into 4, that's the punishment room. You can be in there for weeks. Within this room, the stepbrother fell ill. John was allowed to see him and given some medication for him. He said, "I didn't know it was poison, so I gave it to him, and he died." This is only the beginning. Words such as leave can fall off so easily off our tongues, but John had nowhere to go, which may be another way of saying no way of going. After he was turned into his brother's killer, he was given several different assignments, moved around from one place to another. Eventually, he ended up assigned to one of the sons of the president. He was there when there was a day of celebration in honor of the president. In the evening, after the official celebrations were over, the president's son returned to his house to have fun, along with his men, including John. A woman was brought into a room where the men were gathered. They were ordered to strip her naked. A certain unspeakable indignity was performed. It was really, really bad. It was really bad, John said, his voice very low, and he cried for the first time. The girl was taken away, put in a room to die, or whatever happened. And then her brother was brought in. Another unspeakable indignity was performed. There was blood everywhere. He was really emotional. All this, it later turned out, because the girl hadn't complied with the presidential demand, so a message had to be sent to all the girls who might think to refuse such a man, and to all their family members too. This was, said John, the turning point. He asked to be reassigned. If this involved a personal risk, he didn't say so. At no point in his story did he pass judgments of praise or criticism of his own actions. He merely recounted events. He was assigned the job of guarding an elderly couple. He guarded them for a very long time, and as he says, the man became like a father to me. He tells me, "You're like a son." He talks to me like a son. One day when John was with the couple, soldiers came in and shot them dead. "I thought I'd lost my dad. I was going crazy," he said, crying again. The couple had committed no crime. Their son, though, was wanted by the government. John never knew exactly why. The couple were being held to lure their son out of hiding. It didn't work. And finally, after all this spying, the murder of his brother, the torture of the girl and her brother, the death of his second father, John fled X for life in a country nearby. This is nowhere near the end of the story. Homesickness and hope can be a dangerous combination. John had started some kind of life in this other country. He taught at a school to students who taught him English in exchange, but he was lonely, And when there were demonstrations in X and the president promised reforms, change started to seem possible. John returned to X, but he kept himself hidden, staying with a friend. On Sundays, though, he went to church. It was here that he met Sarah. Met is the wrong word. They knew each other already. Sarah's father was an important government financier who had lived within the protections of the barracks where John had once been posted. John's life was separate from that of Sarah and her family. I couldn't talk to them. They were the rich people, he said. But there was obviously some contact, some connection, because when Sarah saw him, she called him by the name he'd had when he was in the barracks. This name was not his traditional name, and it was not the name John, which he later took on. It was a name given to him by the army during his initiation and inscribed on a bangle that he had to wear on his wrist at all times. He was terrified to be recognized, and it couldn't have helped to hear her say that everyone had been looking for him. He could have run at this point, though he never said so to me. Perhaps it never suggested itself to him as a possibility. Instead, he told her everything. He told her why he had left and of the loneliness that had brought him home. She was sympathetic. She gave him money. He told her, "My name is John now." Every Sunday he would wait for her to come to church. She brought him food and money, and eventually they became, in his words, very intimate. One day he was standing by the church with 2 other men when a jeep pulled up, followed by a car. Someone in the car asked, "Who is John?" He knew, even before this, that something was wrong, knew it as soon as the car pulled up. Sarah was in the car. She gestured to him to run, but the men caught hold of him and took him back to the barracks. Here he found out that Sarah was pregnant, and her father knew. Her father, the government financier, was angry for reasons beyond the usual reasons that make certain kinds of men angry when they discover their daughters have a life beyond their control. He was a leading member of a tribe that practiced female genital mutilation, but his daughter had not been cut, and now he believed her pregnancy would alert people to this fact, and he would be shamed. He wanted the fetus aborted. First, though, he came to the cell where John was held and slapped him. Then he went away, but John remained in the cell where he was, in his words, very maltreated. While he was being held, Sarah went to a man she knew, a soldier who was a friend of her father, and told him what was happening. The man said he couldn't stand by while his friend forced an abortion on his daughter, but there was a limit to how much he could or would do. He smuggled John out of the barracks in his car, gave him the equivalent of 25 pounds and said, "Whatever happens to you after this is not my problem." Still, what he did was enough. John met Sarah at a pre-arranged location, a drinking hole, and together they returned to the country to which John had fled. This still isn't near the end of the story. While in exile, John met an American soldier he knew, a logistics expert called Frank, who had been assigned to assist the army in X when John was serving. He said John should be leading a different life. He suggested emigrating and offered to help with the costs of getting a visa. Frank's first suggestion was that John go to a particular country in mainland Europe, but John was adamantly opposed to the idea. "I didn't trust them because I know that whatever is happening in X, they know about. From A to Z, they know everything, but they wouldn't stop it. I didn't trust them. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to." Instead, John went to the British Embassy. In order to get a visa from the British Embassy, John had to prove he was from the country to which he had fled. The passport that Frank was able to procure for him didn't get past the British visa official, who handed him over to the immigration authorities. Once again, he was imprisoned and told he had to stay in a cell while the authorities sorted his case out. Then, without explanation, he was released. "Why?" he asked, and they only said, "You are free to go." He walked out of the prison and a car was waiting for him. He was kidnapped and driven back to X. That was really horrible. I thought that was it. I really thought that was it. It was difficult for me. They nearly killed me. At every other point when John cried, he carried on speaking through the tears, but this time he stopped, apologized, took some time before he was able to continue. It wasn't Sarah's father who had had him picked up, but someone far worse, the president's son, to whom he had once been assigned. He has a house like a stadium, and it has prisons and all the torture things you can think of. That's all he said the first time, before moving on to the next part of his story. Later, when he had finished his tale, but it was clear there were things still to say, things that he hadn't worked into a narrative over which he had some control, he went back in his mind to that place, to the house like a stadium, with all the torture things you can think of, and said some of the things that were done to him. I will not say them here. I'd only say there were many different ways of inflicting pain, and he couldn't have known if it would continue on for weeks, or months, or years. After they were done, at what point do torturers decide they're done, they sent him to an army camp to become a commando. Perhaps they thought they tortured enough fear and obedience into him. The commandos were men without families, expected to kill or die without a second thought because there's no one for you. He was taken to the captain of the commando camp, and the man turned out to be an old friend of his who had been recruited to the army at the same time as John. John told him he wasn't a man without a family, a man ready to die, but that instead he had a wife and a child he needed to get back to. And this friend, he just wanted to help me, John said. And so he said, okay. Well, he put his life at risk for me. He let me go. For the third time, John returned to his country of exile. How could this possibly be the end of the story? Because he allowed John to escape, the captain's hands were placed in wet cement, which was left to dry, and he was dropped into the sea. His dead body washed up on a beach. John received news of this when he was in exile. Frank, the American, must have known that his early attempts to get John out of the country had gone disastrously wrong. When John was returned, Frank came to him again. This time, he had a signed document from a friend who worked in the High Court to verify that John had renounced his original nationality and was from his country of exile. With this document, John was able to apply for and receive a 6-month UK visa. This is the beginning of the end of the story, but only the beginning. John's brother, the one who his stepbrother was supposed to bring into the barracks for his role in opposition politics, had long since escaped to mainland Europe, and from there had come to England. John met up with him in London and told him of his intention to apply for asylum. But his brother talked him out of it. He'd applied himself and been rejected, and was adamant that John couldn't trust the system, never mind how many supporting documents he had. So John moved in with his brother and didn't seek asylum. His greatest concern was sending money back to Sarah, who by now had had another child. His brother kept saying he would help out, but he didn't, and finally John started to work illegally as a kitchen porter. One day while he was working, the police arrived and arrested him. I told the police officer, "What's happening to me?" And all the police officers just said to me, "Well, you are one of them." I was put in a car and they took me to the police station, and I applied for asylum there. By this time too, I had incontinence through the torture I'd had back home. They, the men who tortured him, they tied my penis, and then I had to drink something that makes you want to urinate, but you can't urinate. When that happened, I passed out. John was in prison for 6 months. From there he was sent to a detention center and placed on his own in a disabled cell. I was on my own, he said, twice, remembering that time. But he also recalled some good people from his period of detention. In particular, he mentioned a priest who supported him when he thought of killing himself, and who also found people to help him with his incontinence. His asylum application was rejected. He appealed. An Australian professor based in America who had done a lot of work on X came to know of his case. This man first spoke to him on the phone and then wrote to the Home Office detailing the situation in X and said that if John was sent back there, he would be killed. "He really saved me," John said. He was granted asylum. But in all this, John had lost track of Sarah. Their lives in exile had always felt fearful. They moved every month, never let anyone get close enough to ask questions about their lives. And while John was in the UK, someone came around to where Sarah was living, asking questions. It was enough to make her flee with her 3 children. John hadn't known when he left for the UK that Sarah was pregnant again. In John's tale, there's great brutality, but there are also stories of kindness, sometimes from friends and families, sometimes from acquaintances and strangers. A charity in the north of England started to work with Frank, who was now back in America, to try and trace Sarah. When they found her where she was exiled, she was in a hospital, dying. Of all the parts in the story that he didn't want to tell, this is the one he most completely skimmed over. "They are here now. They are here," he said, in response to whatever look I gave him when he uttered the word dying. I was left to surmise that someone who is dying in one hospital can turn to recovering in a place with better facilities. Sarah is well now. She's in England with John and their 3 children aged 7, 8, and 11. After all their years of being together and apart and together while apart, they married in London. The church has become their family, and the bishop who married them is someone they count as a friend. There's even been some kind of rapprochement with Sarah's father. A cousin of Sarah's, who she found via Facebook, was the intermediary in this. When he heard about the wedding, he said Sarah should get in touch with her father. She did. She wrote to him about her wedding and her 3 children, and he gave her his blessing. They haven't seen each other, but they speak on the phone. And John is a full-time undergraduate maths student at a London university and hopes to be a teacher one day. "That's all I love doing," he said. He gestured around the room we were in, which was located on the King's College campus. "I've applied to a teacher training program," he said. "I'm waiting for the results." It isn't easy, though. Torture and imprisonment don't let go of a man that easily. "I've come a long way," he said, "but the trauma is still there. So many things happened to me. I don't like looking at it anymore. I just don't like looking at it." But the counseling makes him look at it. "It helps," he said, "but it's hard. It's tiring. It's tiring." Then he started to talk about the torture. Telling me the story brought things up again. But he said again, yes, there are things he has to sort out, but the CBT is helping, and he's fortunate in his wife and his family and his church who are supportive of him. I turned off the recorder at this point. The story was over, I thought. The life will carry on with its struggles and its hardships, but the worst of it is done. A certain kind of narrative of his experiences has come to an end, and his mind can work towards recovery now. I shook his hand and thanked him, and then he said, I don't remember exactly how it came up, that earlier in the year he had applied for indefinite leave to remain in the UK and been denied. I switched the recorder back on. The whole family applied, he said. His wife and children received indefinite leave to remain, but his application was rejected on the grounds he'd been in prison for working illegally all those years ago. He would have to wait another 15 years before he could apply again. Surely not another 15 years. He must mean 15 years in total from the time his asylum application was accepted. No, he said, it starts this year, so another 15 years. From his wallet, he pulled out the residence permits for himself and his children. We keep things around, he said, and I understood he meant that he always had the cards on his person to prove he and his family were legal. The permits for his children all had indefinite leave to remain written on them. Soon they'd be able to apply for citizenship. John's card said, refugee leave to remain. He will have to keep reapplying for an extension every 3 years for the next 15 years. Every reapplication bringing with it the threat of a rejection. The system is a bit... He doesn't have the words and neither do I. He says, I don't understand it.